Your wedding caterer canceled everything this morning, Rachel Klein said quietly over the phone, and for a moment Emily Carter thought she had misheard the words. The late afternoon sunlight filtered through the tall windows of Emily's apartment in downtown Seattle, casting long golden lines across the hardwood floor where invitation samples and seating charts were spread out like pieces of a puzzle she had been assembling for nearly a year. Emily stood still beside the kitchen counter, one hand resting on the cool marble surface while the other held her phone against her ear, her engagement ring catching the light with a small, steady glimmer. She had spent 14 months planning this wedding with careful patience, measuring every decision the way a person might measure ingredients for a recipe meant to feed everyone she loved. The venue overlooked Lake Washington. The ceremony arch would be covered in white peonies and eucalyptus, and the reception menu had been finalized only 2 weeks earlier after 3 tasting sessions that Emily and Daniel Brooks had treated like miniature celebrations of their future. The caterer canceling made no sense. Canceled, Emily repeated slowly, her voice calm but distant, as if the word itself didn't belong in the same sentence as her wedding day. Rachel hesitated on the other end of the call, the faint rustle of papers audible in the background. "I thought you already knew," she said. "We received an email yesterday from your address confirming the cancellation of the catering contract and requesting that all services be terminated immediately." Emily felt a strange stillness settle over the room, the kind of quiet that comes when a clock stops ticking and no one notices at first. Her email. The phrase echoed in her mind like a misplaced note in a song. She turned slightly and looked toward the dining table where the printed timeline for the wedding weekend was laid out in neat columns. Rehearsal dinner at 6, ceremony at 4 the next day, cocktail hour by the lake just as the sun began to drop behind the mountains. Everything was organized down to the minute. Nothing in that plan included canceling the food. "That's not possible," Emily said gently, almost to herself. Across the room, the refrigerator hummed and a delivery truck rolled slowly down the street outside, the ordinary sounds of a normal weekday continuing as if nothing unusual had happened. Rachel's voice lowered. "The email had your signature and confirmation code. Mark from the catering company already processed the cancellation this morning." Emily closed her eyes briefly, trying to imagine sending such a message. She hadn't even opened her laptop the day before. In fact, she had spent most of the afternoon at her parents' house helping her mother sort through boxes of old photographs she insisted might be useful for the reception slideshow. Her mother had been cheerful that afternoon, unusually cheerful, flipping through albums and pointing out pictures from Emily's childhood with a brightness that Emily had found almost touching. Now that memory drifted back into her mind with a faint uneasiness she couldn't quite explain. "Can you forward me the email?" Emily asked quietly. Rachel agreed and promised to send it within minutes. When the call ended, Emily set the phone down carefully and stared at the half-finished seating chart on the table. The names of friends, cousins, and coworkers were written in neat rows, each small card representing someone who would soon gather to celebrate the beginning of a new chapter in her life. Somewhere behind the calm surface of that moment, a single unsettling thought began to take shape. If Emily had never canceled her own wedding caterer, then someone else had done it for her. And whoever sent that message had known exactly what they were doing. Emily Carter remained standing in the quiet apartment long after the call ended, staring at the wedding timeline spread across the dining table, as if the paper itself might suddenly explain what had happened. The evening light had shifted now, the warm gold fading slowly into the cool gray of early dusk, and the room felt different from it had only 20 minutes earlier. The plan that had once felt solid and certain now seemed fragile, like a carefully stacked set of glasses that could collapse with the smallest push. Her phone vibrated softly on the table. Rachel had forwarded the message. Emily sat down slowly and opened the email, her eyes moving across the screen with careful attention. The subject line read "Contract Termination Confirmation," and beneath it was a message that looked completely ordinary at first glance. The tone was polite and direct, the kind of professional email Emily herself might have written. The sender thanked the catering company for their time and requested that all services scheduled for the wedding reception be canceled immediately due to a change in plans. At the bottom of the message appeared her full name, Emily Carter Brooks, followed by the exact signature block she always used. Her phone number. her email address. Everything looked perfect. Too perfect. Emily leaned back slightly in her chair, reading the message again, this time more slowly. She searched for some small clue that it had not come from her, a strange phrase or a mistake in the wording, but nothing stood out. Whoever wrote it had known exactly how she communicated. Outside the apartment window, a city bus passed by with a long sigh of air brakes, and somewhere down the street a car alarm chirped briefly before falling silent again. Normal sounds continued to drift through the evening, but inside Emily's mind the quiet question kept growing louder. She opened the settings of her email account and began checking her recent activity. The login history showed several familiar entries from her phone and laptop during the past week, but there was one unfamiliar login from the previous afternoon. The timestamp made her pause. 3:47 in the afternoon. Yesterday. Emily remembered exactly where she had been at that moment. She had been sitting at the kitchen table in her parents' house, while her mother sorted through boxes of old photographs that had been stored in the hallway closet for years. The memory returned clearly now. Linda Carter had laughed as she held up a faded picture of Emily in a white dress from her elementary school recital, joking that Emily had been practicing for a wedding long before she knew what one meant. Emily had smiled politely at the time, assuming the comment was simply another one of her mother's sentimental observations. But now the timing of that memory felt strangely heavy. Emily looked again at the login location attached to the unfamiliar entry. The system displayed a simple label identifying the network where the account had been accessed. It was not an office building. It was not a coffee shop. It was a residential connection. The location field showed an address that Emily recognized instantly. It was the same quiet suburban street where she had grown up, the same house where her mother still lived. For several seconds Emily did not move at all. The email on. The screen remained open, the polite cancellation message glowing softly against the darkening room. If the system was correct, the message that canceled her wedding catering had been sent from the house, where she had spent most of her childhood. And that meant someone inside that house had logged into her account and written it. Emily Carter remained seated at the dining table long after the screen of her phone dimmed, the quiet apartment surrounding her like a space that no longer felt entirely familiar. The login location still glowed on the screen in small gray text, simple and undeniable, identifying the connection that had accessed her account the afternoon before. It was her mother's house. Emily pressed her fingers lightly against her temple, trying to slow the sudden rush of thoughts that crowded her mind. The logical explanation should have been simple. Someone at that house had logged into her email and sent the cancellation. Yet the conclusion felt impossible to accept. Linda Carter had always been opinionated about the wedding. That was true, but opinionated did not mean destructive. At least that was what Emily had believed until now. She forced herself to breathe slowly and opened the email again, studying every line with careful attention. The message had been written with a tone that sounded calm and professional, almost polite in the way it thanked the catering company for their time and flexibility. Whoever wrote it understood the rhythm of Emily's communication style. The phrasing matched the way she normally spoke in business messages. Even the spacing between paragraphs looked identical to the emails she had written dozens of times while organizing the wedding plans. It was not just someone pretending to be her. It was someone who had watched closely enough to imitate her habits. Emily stood up and walked slowly toward the kitchen window, resting her hand against the cool glass as the evening darkened outside. Streetlights had begun to glow along the sidewalk, and a steady line of headlights moved quietly along the avenue below. The city continued its ordinary rhythm, while Emily's thoughts returned to the afternoon she had spent at her mother's house. Linda had insisted that Emily come over to look through old family albums for the reception slideshow. The living room had been filled with cardboard boxes stacked near the hallway closet, and the two of them had spent hours sorting photographs across the coffee table. Emily could picture the scene clearly now. At one point, she had stepped into the kitchen to answer a short call from Daniel Brooks, leaving her phone and laptop resting on the dining room table. Linda had remained in the room alone. At the time, it had meant nothing. Her mother had simply continued flipping through pictures while Emily talked on the phone near the back door. But now that small detail returned with a quiet weight. Emily walked back to the table and looked again at the unfamiliar login record. 3:47 in the afternoon. The exact moment she had been standing outside on the back patio speaking with Daniel about the final rehearsal dinner schedule. If someone inside the house had opened her laptop during those few minutes, they would have found her email account already signed in. No password needed. No security warning. Just a simple opportunity. Emily felt a slow chill move through her chest. Not from anger, but from the realization that the answer might be closer than she wanted it to be. She looked again at the cancellation email, reading the final line once more where her own name appeared neatly typed at the bottom. Emily Carter Brooks. The name of a bride who had apparently canceled her own wedding reception. And the only person who had been in that house with her at that exact moment was her mother. Emily Carter did not sleep much that night. The apartment remained quiet except for the low hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic moving along the wet streets outside. She had left the email open on her phone, the message glowing faintly on the coffee table as if it were waiting for her to decide what it meant. For several hours, she moved slowly through the apartment, cleaning things that were already clean, straightening stacks of papers that had never been out of place. The careful routines helped her think. Every detail from the previous afternoon replayed in her mind with uncomfortable clarity. The smell of coffee in her mother's kitchen. The soft scratch of cardboard boxes sliding across the hardwood floor. The way Linda Carter had smiled warmly while holding up photographs from years ago. At the time, Emily had believed the afternoon was simple nostalgia, a quiet moment between mother and daughter, before the wedding weekend arrived. Now that memory felt different. Not threatening. Just unsettling in a quiet way that was difficult to ignore. Emily finally sat down again near midnight and opened her laptop, this time looking through the vendor contracts one by one. The catering contract had been canceled, but everything else still appeared active. The florist, the live band, the rental company providing tables and lighting for the reception tent. Each contract represented months of planning and deposits that had already been paid. Emily knew that a single cancellation might have been a mistake or even a misunderstanding. But the timing of that email made the situation impossible to dismiss. The login had come from her mother's house during the exact window of time she had stepped outside to take Daniel's call. Emily remembered that call clearly now. Daniel had been asking about the rehearsal dinner seating, and she had walked out to the patio because the signal inside the house had been weak. The conversation had lasted only 5 minutes. 5 quiet minutes during which her laptop had remained open on the dining room table inside. 5 minutes when Linda had been the only other person in the house. Emily rested her hands against the keyboard and closed her eyes for a moment. Her mother had always been strong-willed. Linda Carter believed deeply in control, in making sure that every decision in her family's life met her standards. Over the past year, she had expressed her doubts about the wedding more than once. She had questioned the size of the guest list. She had criticized the location of the venue, saying it was too far from the neighborhood where Emily had grown up. She had even made small remarks about Daniel Brooks, polite on the surface but sharp enough that Emily had learned to ignore them. At the time, Emily had assumed those comments were simply a mother struggling with the idea that her daughter was starting a new chapter. Many parents felt that way, but now the pattern of those conversations returned with a quiet weight. Emily opened her phone again and looked once more at the cancellation message. The calm tone of the email now felt strangely deliberate, almost as if the sender wanted the message to appear ordinary so no one would question it. Emily imagined the moment it had been written. Someone, sitting at the dining table inside that familiar suburban house, typing carefully while the afternoon sunlight moved across the floor. Someone who knew exactly how important this wedding was. Someone who understood that canceling the catering company would create confusion just days before the ceremony. Emily slowly closed the laptop and looked across the room at the neatly stacked invitations that had already been mailed to more than 100 guests across the country. In less than 2 weeks, those people would arrive expecting to celebrate a wedding. The event was still happening. Emily knew that with quiet certainty. The question that remained was not whether the wedding would take place. The question was why someone had tried to disrupt it, and whether her mother had truly been the person who sent that email. Morning arrived slowly over Seattle, a pale gray light spreading across the apartment as Emily Carter sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had already gone cold. She had been awake for hours, watching the quiet city outside her window while her mind carefully arranged the pieces of what she had discovered. The cancellation email was no longer the only problem. The real issue was trust, and trust was far more difficult to repair than a broken contract. Emily opened her laptop again and began reviewing the vendor list with steady concentration. If someone had canceled one service using her email, it was possible they had tried to interfere with others as well. The florist contract still appeared active. The band was still confirmed for the reception. The lighting company had sent a reminder message about installation schedules for the outdoor tent. Everything else seemed intact. That small detail brought a faint sense of relief, but it did not erase the deeper question waiting in the background. Why had the catering company been targeted specifically? Emily tried to think about the situation the way a stranger might, separating emotion from logic. Catering was the most essential part of the reception. Without food service, a wedding celebration for more than 100 guests would immediately fall into confusion. It was not just an inconvenience. It was the kind of disruption that could make the entire event collapse. Emily wrapped both hands around the coffee mug and stared at the contract confirmation on her screen. Whoever had sent that email had understood exactly how serious the impact would be. A memory surfaced slowly from the previous week. Emily had been sitting with her mother in the living room after dinner while Linda Carter discussed the guest list again, asking questions about relatives she believed should have been invited. At one point, Linda had looked across the table and said in a calm voice that large weddings often became chaotic and wasteful. She had mentioned that spending thousands of dollars on catering seemed unnecessary when family gatherings could be simple and personal. Emily had laughed lightly at the time and explained that Daniel's family expected a formal reception. The conversation had ended there, but the tone of her mother's voice returned to Emily now with uncomfortable clarity. Linda had not sounded angry that night. She had sounded thoughtful, almost calculating in the way she spoke about the event. Emily stood up and walked slowly across the apartment toward the window again, watching the early commuters move along the street below. Daniel would be arriving in an hour to help review the final rehearsal schedule, and Emily knew she would have to explain what had happened. The wedding was only 12 days away. There was still time to fix the canceled contract, but there was not enough time to ignore the reason it had happened. Emily picked up her phone and looked once more at the login record from the afternoon before. The address was still there, quiet and factual in its simplicity. Her mother's house. Emily felt a steady determination settle into place where confusion had been only hours earlier. She did not want to accuse anyone without certainty, especially not her own mother. But she also understood something clearly now. If someone had attempted to interfere with her wedding plans once, they might try again. And Emily Carter was no longer willing to assume it was simply a misunderstanding. Daniel Brooks arrived just after 9 in the morning, carrying a paper bag from the small bakery on the corner and 2 cups of coffee balanced carefully in his hands. The air outside was cool and damp from overnight rain, and the smell of fresh bread followed him into the apartment as Emily opened the door. He immediately noticed the tension in her expression. Emily was normally calm during stressful situations, especially when they were planning the wedding, but there was something different in her posture now. She looked focused in a quiet, determined way that Daniel had only seen a few times before. He set the bag on the kitchen counter and handed her one of the coffee cups. "You look like you did not sleep," he said gently. Emily gave a small nod and motioned toward the dining table where her laptop was still open. The cancellation email glowed on the screen exactly where she had left it. Daniel walked closer and read the message slowly, his brow tightening as he reached the signature at the bottom. "You did not send this," he said quietly. Emily shook her head once. "No, but it came from my email account." Daniel pulled out the chair beside her and sat down, reading the message again while Emily opened the login history on her screen. She pointed to the entry showing the time stamp and the connection location. Daniel studied it for several seconds before leaning back in the chair. "That is your mother's address," he said carefully. Emily folded her hands together on the table and looked down at the wood grain beneath them. Saying the words out loud made the situation feel heavier than it had only minutes earlier. "Yes," she replied softly. The kitchen remained quiet for a moment except for the faint hum of the coffee maker. Daniel was not the type of person who rushed to conclusions, and Emily appreciated that about him now more than ever. Instead of reacting with anger, he looked thoughtful, as if he were trying to understand every angle before speaking. "Could someone else have used that network?" he asked. Emily considered the possibility. Her mother lived alone in the same suburban house where Emily had grown up. There were no roommates, no relatives staying there temporarily, No neighbors who might casually walk inside and borrow a computer. The house had always been quiet, orderly, and private. Emily slowly shook her head. No one else was there yesterday, she said. Daniel nodded slowly and looked again at the cancellation message. The two of them sat together in silence for a moment, each thinking about the same uncomfortable possibility. Finally, Daniel spoke in a calm voice. If someone canceled the catering using your email, then they probably believed no one would question it. That means they expected the message to look normal. Emily turned the phone slightly so Daniel could see the entire message again. It does look normal, she said. That is what makes it so strange. Daniel leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. Then the person who wrote it knew how you usually communicate, he said. The thought hung in the quiet kitchen like a fact that neither of them wanted to say directly. Emily looked down at the login location again. Her mother's house. The familiar address sat there calmly on the screen, as if it were simply another technical detail. But for Emily, it had become the center of a question she could no longer ignore. If Linda Carter had truly logged into that account and canceled the catering contract, then the problem was not a simple mistake. It meant someone very close to her had deliberately interfered with the most important event of her life. Daniel Brooks did not speak for several seconds after Emily finished explaining everything she had discovered. The quiet kitchen felt heavier now, the morning sunlight slowly filling the room while both of them studied the laptop screen on the table. The address connected to the login remained unchanged, calm and factual, as if it had no idea how much weight it carried. Daniel finally leaned back in his chair and folded his hands together. Before we assume anything, he said carefully, we should think about what someone hoped to accomplish. Emily nodded slightly. That question had been circling in her mind since the night before. Canceling the catering contract did not stop the wedding entirely, but it created confusion and pressure only days before the ceremony. Replacing a professional catering service for more than 100 guests on short notice would not be simple. The disruption alone could force Emily and Daniel to delay the reception or change the entire structure of the event. Emily looked down at the vendor list again. Whoever sent the email knew that, she said quietly. Daniel nodded. Yes, this was not random. The two of them sat silently for a moment while the significance of that realization settled between them. Finally, Emily closed the laptop halfway and looked toward the window. My mother has always believed weddings should be small, she said slowly. She mentioned it again last week when we talked about the reception dinner. Daniel remembered that conversation. Linda Carter had spoken politely but firmly about her belief that large celebrations were unnecessary and overly expensive. At the time, it had sounded like a simple disagreement about style and tradition. But now the memory felt different. Emily continued speaking, her voice steady even though the thought behind it was difficult. She also asked several questions about the catering contract during that conversation. Daniel turned his attention back to the laptop. What kind of questions? Emily rested her hands on the table and tried to remember the details clearly. She wanted to know when the final payment was due. She asked whether the vendor would allow changes to the menu at the last minute. Daniel frowned slightly. Those are the kind of questions someone asks if they are thinking about altering the contract. Emily felt a slow wave of realization move through her chest. The pattern was becoming harder to ignore. Linda had expressed doubts about the reception, asked detailed questions about the vendor arrangements, and then less than a week later someone using her home network had canceled the most important service connected to the celebration. Emily stood up and walked slowly across the kitchen floor, stopping beside the counter where Daniel had placed the paper bag from the bakery. The smell of warm bread still filled the room, but she had no appetite for it now. Instead, she looked back at Daniel with a quiet seriousness. If my mother did send that message, she said softly, then she expected no one to notice until it was too late to fix. Daniel understood the meaning behind those words immediately. 12 days remained before the wedding. If the cancellation had gone unnoticed for several more days, the catering company might have booked another event in that time slot. By the time Emily discovered the problem, replacing the service would have been nearly impossible. Daniel closed the laptop gently and looked at Emily with calm determination. Then the most important thing right now is making sure nothing else gets canceled, he said. Emily nodded once. For the first time since the strange email appeared on her screen, she felt a clear direction forming in her mind. The wedding plans would continue exactly as scheduled, but from this moment forward, she would watch every detail carefully because someone had already tried once to disrupt the event, and she had the uneasy feeling that the attempt might not be over yet. Emily. Carter spent the rest of the morning moving through the apartment with a calm focus that Daniel recognized immediately. It was the same quiet determination she had shown when planning every detail of the wedding during the past year. When Emily decided something mattered, she did not panic. She organized. The first thing she did was call Rachel Klein. The wedding planner answered on the second ring, her voice professional but curious. Emily explained that the catering cancellation had not been authorized and that the contract needed to be reinstated immediately if possible. Rachel listened carefully and responded with reassuring confidence. The catering company had not yet filled the date with another event. If Emily confirmed within the next few hours, the service could be restored with only a small administrative fee. Emily thanked her and asked Rachel to handle the reinstatement right away. As the call ended, Daniel watched the tension in Emily's shoulders ease slightly. One problem had been solved, but the deeper issue remained. Emily then opened a new document on her laptop and began writing a list of every vendor connected to the wedding weekend. The florist, the lighting company, the band, the rental service providing tables and linens. Each name appeared in careful order across the screen along with the contact information for the representative managing the contract. Daniel understood what she was doing before she said a word. "You are going to confirm everything," he said quietly. Emily nodded. "Every contract, every schedule, every detail." Daniel stood beside her chair as she began making the calls one by one. The florist confirmed that the order for white peonies and eucalyptus arrangements was still active. The lighting company confirmed the delivery time for the outdoor reception tent. The band confirmed their rehearsal time the night before the ceremony. With each conversation, Emily felt a little more control returning to the situation. Nothing else had been canceled. Nothing else had been altered. Whoever had sent that single email had focused only on the catering service. When the last call ended, Emily leaned back in her chair and looked at the list again. The pattern was clearer now. The disruption had been precise, almost surgical in its timing. One contract, one email, one moment when Emily had stepped away from her laptop for only a few minutes. Daniel rested a hand gently on the back of her chair. "So now we know something important," he said. Emily looked up at him. "What is that?" Daniel answered calmly. "The person who sent that message believed you would not notice immediately." Emily thought about that carefully. If the cancellation had remained hidden for several days, the catering company might have accepted another booking. By the time Emily discovered the problem, replacing a full-service vendor for more than 100 guests would have been extremely difficult. The reception could have collapsed under the pressure of last-minute changes. Emily closed the laptop slowly and folded her hands together. The quiet kitchen felt different now, less uncertain, more focused. She no longer felt confused about what had happened. Instead, she felt a steady awareness that someone had taken a calculated step to interfere with the wedding plans. Emily stood and walked to the window again, watching the city continue its ordinary rhythm below. Somewhere across town, her mother was probably beginning her day in the same quiet suburban house where Emily had grown up. Emily did not know yet whether Linda Carter had truly sent that email, but she knew one thing with complete certainty now. If someone had expected the wedding to unravel quietly behind the scenes, they had misjudged how carefully Emily Carter watched the details of her own life. The afternoon light had shifted by the time Emily Carter finished confirming every vendor contract, leaving the apartment filled with a quiet glow that reflected off the glass dining table where her laptop still rested. The tension that had filled the room earlier had not disappeared, but it had changed into something more controlled. Emily no longer felt like someone reacting to a sudden problem. Instead, she felt like someone studying a puzzle whose pieces were slowly beginning to align. Daniel Brooks had moved to the living room sofa with his laptop, reviewing the timeline for the rehearsal dinner while Emily sat silently at the table, thinking through every conversation she had shared with her mother during the past several months. It was strange how memories could shift once a new piece of information entered the story. Comments that once seemed harmless now carried a slightly different weight. Emily remembered a lunch they had shared 3 weeks earlier at a small restaurant near the waterfront. Linda Carter had listened politely while Emily described the reception menu the catering company had proposed. At the time, Emily had thought her mother simply looked distracted. Now she remembered something else. Linda had asked whether the caterer required written confirmations for changes to the contract. Emily had laughed lightly and said that of course everything was handled through email, because that was the easiest way to keep records organized. Emily had not thought about that question again until this moment. She slowly closed her eyes and replayed the memory with careful attention. Her mother had not sounded angry during that conversation. She had sounded curious, methodical even. Emily opened her eyes again and looked across the room toward Daniel. He noticed her expression immediately and closed his laptop. "What are you thinking?" he asked gently. Emily hesitated for a moment before answering. "I think my mother may have been planning this longer than we realized." Daniel remained quiet, waiting for her to explain. Emily stood and walked slowly toward the kitchen counter, resting one hand against the cool surface while she spoke. She described the lunch conversation and the specific questions Linda had asked about vendor contracts and written confirmations. Daniel listened carefully, his expression thoughtful rather than surprised. When Emily finished speaking, he nodded slowly. "That would explain why the email looked so convincing," he said. Emily understood what he meant. Whoever had written the cancellation message had not guessed how the contract worked. They had known exactly how to communicate with the vendor in a way that appeared legitimate. The person who sent that message had prepared for it. Emily looked again at the laptop screen where the list of vendors still glowed quietly in the center of the table. The apartment remained peaceful, the steady rhythm of the city continuing beyond the windows as if nothing unusual had happened. But inside Emily's mind the pattern had become clearer with every passing hour. Linda Carter had questioned the reception plans for months. She had studied the vendor arrangements carefully. And now someone using her home network had sent a cancellation message designed to disrupt the entire celebration. Emily walked back to the table and closed the laptop slowly. The quiet click of the lid sounded almost final in the still room. She was no longer uncertain about what had happened. The only uncertainty that remained was whether her mother believed she would ever discover the truth. Late afternoon settled quietly over the apartment as Emily Carter and Daniel Brooks continued sitting at the dining table, the earlier urgency slowly transforming into something calmer but far more deliberate. The catering contract had already been restored through Rachel Klein, and confirmation messages from the vendor had arrived within the hour. On the surface, the crisis had been resolved quickly, but the sense of normalcy felt thin, like a temporary repair covering a deeper crack beneath it. Emily understood something now that she had not fully grasped the night before. The cancellation email had not been an emotional reaction or a careless mistake. It had been written carefully, sent at the precise moment when she had stepped away from her laptop, and targeted toward the one vendor capable of disrupting the entire reception. The thought moved quietly through her mind as she reviewed the timeline for the wedding weekend once more. 12 days remained before the ceremony. 12 days in which any number of small changes could create confusion if someone was determined enough to interfere again. Daniel watched her as she studied the list of vendors for a second time. "You are thinking about the next step," he said gently. Emily nodded without looking up. "If someone did this once, they might try again," she replied. Daniel understood immediately. The pattern they had discovered suggested planning rather than impulse. Whoever had written that message had expected the cancellation to remain unnoticed until it was too late to recover. The only reason the situation had been repaired so quickly was because Rachel had called Emily directly to confirm the decision. Emily closed the laptop slowly and folded her hands together on the table. The quiet sound of rain beginning again outside filled the apartment with a steady rhythm. "I am not going to confront my mother yet," she said after a moment. Daniel looked at her carefully. "You are certain she was responsible?" Emily took a slow breath before answering. "I am certain someone inside that house used my account." The distinction mattered to her. Accusing her mother without undeniable proof would only create chaos in the family days before the wedding. But ignoring the possibility entirely would leave the plans exposed to further interference. Emily stood and walked toward the window again, watching the gray sky darken above the city skyline. Somewhere across town, Linda Carter was probably preparing dinner in the same quiet kitchen where Emily had grown up. The house had always been orderly, predictable, controlled by Linda's careful routines. Emily had learned discipline and attention to detail from her mother. Ironically, those same habits had now helped Emily notice the small clues that exposed the cancellation attempt. Daniel stood beside her at the window. "So what do we do?" he asked quietly. Emily turned back toward the dining table where the laptop rested. The screen had gone dark, reflecting her expression faintly in the glass. When she spoke again, her voice was calm and steady. "We continue planning the wedding exactly as before," she said. "But from now on, every vendor communicates directly with both of us and with Rachel. No changes are accepted without confirmation." Daniel nodded slowly. It was a simple solution, but an effective one. If someone tried to send another message pretending to be Emily, the vendor would verify the request before taking action. Emily returned to the table and opened the laptop once more, updating the vendor contact instructions in a new email that would be sent to every company involved in the event. The message was polite and professional, explaining that due to recent scheduling confusion, all contract modifications would now require direct phone confirmation. When she finished typing, Emily paused briefly before pressing send. The email disappeared from the screen with a quiet click. The wedding plans were now protected by a system that made silent interference far more difficult. And somewhere deep in her mind, Emily had the quiet feeling that the person who sent that first cancellation message had not expected her to respond so carefully. The rain outside the apartment continued through the evening, tapping softly against the windows while Emily Carter finished sending the final confirmation emails to every vendor involved in the wedding. One by one, the responses began arriving in her inbox. The florist confirmed that all contract changes would require direct phone verification. The lighting company replied with the same agreement. The band manager wrote a brief message promising that no schedule adjustments would be accepted unless both Emily and Daniel Brooks approved them personally. Each message added another quiet layer of protection around the plans that had taken more than a year to build. Emily leaned back in her chair and looked across the dining table where the stack of printed schedules still lay, in careful order. For the first time since the strange cancellation message appeared, the situation felt stable again. But stability did not erase the larger question that continued to linger beneath everything else. Somewhere across town, Linda Carter was probably sitting in the same quiet living room where Emily had grown up, perhaps reading a book or watching the evening news the way she often did. Emily tried to imagine what her mother might be thinking at that exact moment. If Linda had truly sent the cancellation email, she might still believe that the disruption would remain hidden until it caused real damage. The possibility created an odd sense of distance between Emily and the person who had raised her. Daniel walked back into the kitchen carrying 2 fresh cups of tea and placed one gently beside Emily's laptop. "You have been working for hours," he said with a small smile. Emily wrapped her hands around the warm cup and nodded slowly. "Everything is confirmed again," she replied. Daniel sat down across from her and studied her expression carefully. He could see that although the logistical problems had been solved, Emily's thoughts were still moving through the deeper implications of what had happened. "You are still thinking about your mother," he said quietly. Emily did not deny it. She stared at the soft reflection of the ceiling light on the surface of her tea for several seconds before answering. "I keep asking myself the same question," she said. "If she wanted to stop the wedding, why did she do it this way?" Daniel understood the meaning behind that thought. Linda Carter had always been a direct person. Throughout Emily's childhood, she had expressed her opinions openly, sometimes firmly, but rarely in secret. Sending a message from Emily's own account felt different. It felt careful and hidden in a way that did not match the mother Emily thought she knew. Daniel leaned back in his chair and considered the situation calmly. "Maybe she did not want to stop the wedding entirely," he suggested. Emily looked up. "Then what was the goal?" Daniel gestured toward the vendor list on the table. "Maybe she hoped the plans would fall apart on their own. If the catering service disappeared at the last minute, the reception might become too complicated to organize." Emily thought about that possibility carefully. It would not cancel the ceremony itself, but it could create enough pressure and embarrassment to make the entire event feel chaotic. For someone who valued control as much as Linda Carter did, that kind of disruption might seem like a way to prove a point without openly confronting her daughter. Emily set the teacup down slowly. The thought did not make her angry. Instead, it brought a quiet clarity to the situation. If someone had tried to interfere with the wedding by creating confusion, the most powerful response would be simple stability. Emily looked across the table at Daniel and gave a small nod. The plans would continue exactly as they were. And when the wedding day finally arrived, every detail would still be standing exactly where it belonged. The next morning arrived with a quiet clarity that felt almost unusual after the tension of the previous 2 days. Sunlight streamed through the apartment windows, reflecting softly across the dining table where Emily Carter had once again arranged the wedding schedule, vendor contacts, and guest list in careful order. The rain had passed overnight, leaving the city streets bright and clean beneath a pale blue sky. Emily sat with her laptop open in front of her, reviewing the messages that had arrived overnight. Every vendor had acknowledged the new communication rule requiring phone confirmation for any contract change. The system she and Daniel Brooks had put in place was working exactly as intended. For the first time since the cancellation message appeared, Emily felt the quiet confidence that the wedding plans were no longer vulnerable to silent interference. Daniel walked into the kitchen a few minutes later, carrying 2 plates of toast and setting them gently on the table. "Everything still looks stable," he said as he glanced at the open laptop screen. Emily nodded. "Every vendor confirmed again this morning." Daniel smiled faintly and sat down across from her. The calm atmosphere in the apartment felt almost like the early days of their wedding planning, before the strange email had complicated everything. Yet Emily understood that something inside her perspective had changed permanently. She had always believed that careful planning could prevent most problems. Now she understood that sometimes the greatest challenge came not from logistics, but from the intentions of people close to you. Emily closed the laptop slowly and rested her hands on the table. "I am going to visit my mother this afternoon," she said after a moment. Daniel looked up immediately. "Are you planning to confront her?" Emily shook her head gently. "No, not yet." She had thought about the decision carefully throughout the night. Accusing Linda Carter directly without absolute proof would create a conflict that could ripple through the entire family just days before the ceremony. Emily wanted something different. She wanted understanding. Daniel studied her expression and nodded slowly, trusting her instinct. "Then what do you want to see?" he asked. Emily looked toward the window where the bright morning light filled the room. "I want to see how she behaves," she said quietly. Linda Carter had always been confident, composed, and precise in the way she managed conversations. Emily believed that if her mother had truly sent the cancellation email, there might be small signs in her reactions that revealed more than words ever would. A casual remark about the reception, a subtle question about the catering company. Sometimes people revealed their intentions not through dramatic actions, but through the smallest shifts in tone. Emily stood and carried the empty plates to the sink while Daniel watched her thoughtfully. The situation between Emily and her mother now felt like a quiet chess match, where each move revealed a little more about the strategy behind it. Emily dried her hands and turned back toward the dining table where the carefully arranged wedding plans still rested in perfect order. The ceremony was 12 days away. The flowers, the music, the lighting, and now the catering service were all confirmed once again. Whatever had happened during that strange afternoon when the email was sent, the celebration itself was still moving forward exactly as planned. And as Emily prepared to visit her mother later that day, she carried with her a quiet awareness that the next conversation might reveal far more than the message that had started everything. Emily Carter left the apartment shortly after noon, the sky above Seattle clear and bright after the long stretch of rain that had covered the city earlier in the week. The drive to her mother's house took a little less than 30 minutes, following a familiar route she had traveled hundreds of times since childhood. As her car moved through the quieter suburban streets where she had grown up, Emily felt an unusual calm settle over her thoughts. 2 days earlier she might have arrived feeling anxious or defensive. Now she felt something different, a steady awareness that careful observation would reveal more than confrontation ever could. Linda Carter's house appeared exactly as it always had, the small white fence lining the front yard and the neatly trimmed hedges framing the walkway to the door. Nothing about the house suggested tension or secrecy. It looked like the same orderly place where Emily had spent most of her childhood years. Emily parked along the curb and walked slowly toward the front door, noticing the scent of freshly cut grass in the warm afternoon air. When she knocked, it took only a moment before the door opened. Linda Carter stood there with the same composed expression Emily had known all her life. Her light sweater and pressed slacks gave her the appearance of someone who had already finished the day's errands and settled into the quiet rhythm of the afternoon. "Emily," Linda said with a small smile that seemed both warm and slightly surprised. I was not expecting you today. Emily returned the smile calmly and stepped inside when her mother moved aside to let her pass. The interior of the house looked unchanged, every surface arranged in the careful order Linda always preferred. A bowl of fruit sat neatly in the center of the dining table, and the soft sound of classical music drifted from the living room speakers. Emily set her purse on the hallway table and turned toward her mother. I had a free afternoon, she said casually. I thought it would be nice to visit. Linda nodded and walked toward the kitchen, already reaching for 2 glasses as if the visit had been planned all along. I just made some iced tea, she said. You look busy these days. I assume the wedding planning is keeping you occupied. Emily followed her into the kitchen and leaned lightly against the counter while Linda poured the tea. The moment felt almost ordinary, yet Emily's attention sharpened quietly as she listened to her mother's tone. Yes, Emily replied. There have been a few unexpected changes this week. Linda handed her the glass and raised her eyebrows slightly. Changes, she repeated with mild curiosity. Emily took a small sip of the tea before answering. One of the vendors thought I had canceled the contract, she said calmly. The sentence hung in the quiet kitchen. For a moment, Linda paused briefly while setting the pitcher back on the counter, her hand resting against the glass handle for a fraction of a second longer than necessary. The movement was subtle, so small that most people might not have noticed it at all. But Emily noticed. Linda turned back toward her daughter with the same composed smile she always wore. That sounds inconvenient, she said lightly. I hope you were able to fix it. Emily met her mother's eyes and returned the same calm expression. Yes, she said. It was fixed very quickly. The room fell quiet again except for the faint music playing in the next room. And as Emily stood there watching her mother's steady composure, she realized something important. Linda Carter had not asked which vendor had been canceled. She had not asked how the mistake had happened. Instead, she had responded with the kind of careful neutrality that someone might use when they already knew more about the situation than they wanted to reveal. Emily Carter remained in the kitchen for several minutes after that small pause, holding her glass of iced tea while watching her mother move calmly around the room as if nothing unusual had been said. Linda Carter rinsed the pitcher in the sink and wiped the counter with a folded cloth, her movements slow and precise in the way they had always been. The afternoon sunlight filtered through the kitchen window, casting soft reflections across the polished countertop. On the surface, the moment felt peaceful, almost ordinary. But Emily's attention had sharpened. Her mother's earlier reaction remained fixed in her mind. Linda had not asked the natural questions most people would ask when hearing about a wedding vendor cancellation. She had not asked which company had been involved. She had not asked how the mistake happened or whether the situation might affect the ceremony. Instead, she had offered a simple comment and then moved on. Emily took another small sip of tea before speaking again. It was the catering company, she said casually, as if the detail had only just occurred to her. Linda paused again, though the movement was even smaller this time. She turned slightly and leaned against the counter with her arms folded, her expression thoughtful but carefully neutral. That must have been inconvenient, she said after a moment. Catering is usually the most complicated part of a reception. Emily noticed the phrasing immediately. Her mother had not sounded surprised by the specific vendor being mentioned. Instead, she had responded with quiet familiarity, as though the situation made perfect sense to her. Emily placed the glass gently on the counter and watched her mother for another second. It turned out to be an email issue, she added calmly. Someone sent a message from my account canceling the contract. Linda raised her eyebrows slightly, though the gesture felt controlled rather than spontaneous. That is unusual, she replied. Did you find out who sent it? Emily shook her head slowly. Not exactly, she said, but the login history showed where the message came from. The sentence hung between them in the quiet kitchen. Outside the open window, a distant lawn mower hummed softly somewhere down the street, blending with the faint music still drifting from the living room speakers. Linda reached for the fruit bowl and picked up a small apple, turning it thoughtfully in her hand, as if considering whether to take a bite. Technology can be unpredictable sometimes, she said lightly. Emails get forwarded or accounts stay logged in longer than people realize. Emily listened carefully to every word. Her mother's tone remained calm, but the explanation arrived a little too quickly, almost as if Linda had already rehearsed the possibility in her own mind. Emily folded her hands loosely together and leaned back against the opposite counter. That is true, she said. Accounts do stay open sometimes. Linda finally took a bite of the apple and nodded once. Well, at least the problem was resolved, she said. Weddings are stressful enough without computer problems complicating things. Emily watched her mother for another moment, studying the familiar confidence in Linda's posture. Nothing about her behavior appeared nervous or defensive. Instead, Linda seemed comfortable, even relaxed, as if she believed the conversation had already passed the point of importance. And in that quiet realization, Emily understood something subtle but unmistakable. Her mother was not reacting like someone who had just heard surprising news. She was reacting like someone who had expected the situation to come up eventually and had already decided how she would respond. Emily Carter remained in the kitchen for several minutes after her mother finished speaking, allowing the quiet rhythm of the afternoon to settle naturally around them. The faint music from the living room continued playing, and the sunlight through the window had shifted slightly across the countertop. Linda Carter rinsed the apple in the sink and placed the knife neatly beside the cutting board, her movements steady and unhurried. Nothing in her posture suggested tension or discomfort. If anything, she seemed almost pleased with how ordinary the conversation had been. Emily watched her carefully, realizing that the calm composure she had known her entire life could now hide intentions she had never considered before. At least the vendor was able to restore the contract quickly, Emily said after a moment, keeping her tone light and conversational. Linda nodded once without looking up from the counter. That is good to hear, she replied. Large events require so many moving parts. A single mistake can cause a surprising amount of disruption. The wording caught Emily's attention immediately. Her mother spoke about disruption as if she had already imagined the consequences in detail. Emily set her empty glass on the counter and leaned slightly against the cabinet beside her. It would have caused problems if we had not noticed quickly, she said calmly. Linda dried her hands with a folded towel and turned to face her daughter again. But you did notice, she said with a small reassuring smile. That is what matters. Emily met her mother's gaze for a few seconds. The confidence in Linda's expression had not changed. It was the same composed certainty Emily had seen during countless family decisions when she was growing up. Linda Carter had always believed that careful planning and strong judgment produced the best results. That belief had shaped nearly every aspect of the household Emily remembered from childhood. Emily folded her arms loosely and tilted her head slightly. It was interesting how the message was written, she said. The wording sounded exactly like the emails I usually send to vendors. Linda's eyes flickered briefly toward the dining room doorway before returning to Emily's face. The movement lasted less than a second, but Emily noticed it. Some people pay close attention to communication style, Linda replied, especially if they have read enough messages over time. The answer arrived smoothly, almost too smoothly. Emily felt the quiet certainty in her thoughts grow stronger. Her mother was not speaking as someone who had just imagined a hypothetical situation. She was describing a process she clearly understood. Emily took a slow breath and allowed a small, thoughtful smile to appear on her face. That makes sense, she said. It would require careful observation. Linda nodded once and walked toward the dining room table, adjusting the fruit bowl slightly, as if restoring it to the perfect position. The ordinary movement seemed deliberate, like a subtle signal that the topic had reached its natural conclusion. Emily followed her a few steps into the dining room and looked around the familiar space where so many family dinners had taken place over the years. Everything in the room appeared exactly the same as it had during her childhood. The same polished table, the same framed photographs along the wall, the same quiet order that reflected Linda's careful control of her environment. Yet now Emily saw the room with a new understanding. Her mother had always valued control more than anything else. And if the wedding plans threatened that sense of control, Linda Carter might very well have believed she was simply correcting a situation that had gone too far beyond her influence. Emily rested her hand lightly on the back of one of the dining chairs and looked toward her mother again. Linda stood by the window, arranging the curtains slightly, her expression calm and unreadable. And in that quiet moment, Emily realized that her mother was not waiting to see whether the wedding would happen. She was waiting to see whether the disruption she had created would eventually reshape the event the way she believed it should be.